Okay, so now I want to introduce another distinction, and that's between the word is and the word ought, or really the ideas that they represent, is versus ought. Another way you want to think about is versus ought is descriptive versus prescriptive. Okay, so on the one hand, all we're doing is we're describing the way the world is. Okay, so you can imagine claims that do this, that merely describe the way the world is, versus on the other hand, you can conjure up some claims that do more than that. They say how the world ought to be. They are prescriptive claims. Okay? You can say, for example, the wealth inequality in America is whatever, right? You can use some statistical measures, the Gini coefficient. On the other hand, you can say, well, okay, given that that's what the wealth inequality is, what should we do about it, right? What ought we to do about it? Make a prescriptive claim. It's good that the wealth inequality is what it is. It's bad that it's what it is, and we should do something to change it. Okay, so these are just different postures you're taking. Another way to think about it is, on the one hand, you're just observing the world, and on the other hand, you're passing judgment. You're injecting or revealing your values about the world. So I'm like kind of listing all these different ways because on the LSAT, you're going to see like this idea versus this idea represented in different ways. You know, I mentioned the word should. I didn't write that down, but I could have. I could have said is versus, should. See, the thing is, I don't think I can ever give you an exhaustive, complete list of all the ways to describe prescriptive ideas or even descriptive ideas because I think that list just goes on and on. So what I want to do is I just want to bring to your attention this contrast because this is a contrast that persists all throughout logical reasoning. Your ability to tell the difference between is versus ought, that's going to determine your ability to tell the right answers from the wrong answers and figure out why the right answers are right and the wrong ones are wrong. So here I'll just go into a little bit more of a detail. We're going to see an upcoming question, this distinction, but here I just want to go into a bit more detail about one way in which the test writers utilize this distinction, and they utilize it in creating a bridge, or really it's a gap, right? Before the bridge is built, there's just a gap between the premise to the conclusion, okay? And the premise will be something like an is premise, right? Or you want to think about it as a descriptive premise. And the conclusion will be something like an ought, right? Or should, or prescriptive conclusion. And you're going to have to recognize when you do argument analysis, and here I'm foreshadowing later lessons on weakening, strengthening, sufficient assumption questions, PSA questions, you're going to have to recognize that an argument of this form is making a crucial assumption. And that assumption is the is to ought bridge. Okay, so let's see an example of this. Let's say I tell you, look, the house is on fire. With an exclamation mark, right? It's really on fire. And I say, okay, well, therefore, right? So I conclude from this fact that the house is on fire. Therefore, we should, or we ought to, put out the fire. Now, you might think, okay, first of all, it's an argument, right? You can recognize the premise, which supports the conclusion. And by the way, this line is just a convention of representing arguments. Above the line is what we call premises. Below the line is what we call conclusion. I never explicitly said this, but I think you've seen it in previous lessons where I use this convention. Okay, so now you recognize this is an argument and I ask you evaluate the strength of the argument. Hopefully you recall back to the lesson where I talked about the reasonableness of the assumptions that are made determines the strength of the argument here. I hope you recognize that at minimum there is a big assumption being made. And not just like, oh yeah, of course if the house is on fire, we should put the fire out, right? Because what is the assumption here? And I already hinted at it earlier, right? It's this is to ought assumption. The assumption you're making is that just because the house is on fire, which is merely a descriptive, you see how we're just describing the world? We're just looking down at the world. We're like, oh, look, a house. Oh, it's on fire. We're just describing the world, right? From that premise, does it follow that therefore we should put out the fire? It's not clear because you don't know anything about the house. You don't know what kind of fire it is. You don't know why the house is on fire, crucially, right? I bet what you already did, if, some of you might have been like, well, this is not a good argument because there's an is-ought gap. Some of you might have been, this is a great argument. If the house is on fire, of course we should put the fire out. For the latter of you who thought that, you made crucial assumptions not in the argument, but you supplied it to the argument. You assume that this house is like in a residential neighborhood. You assume that the house had people in it that we needed to rescue. You assume that this house was valuable property that the owners or other interested parties didn't want to be on fire. You notice like none of those assumptions are present in the argument. You injected them into the argument in order to arrive at the conclusion. In other words, the argument kind of baited you, right? It baited you. It's like, come on, please make these assumptions. If that happened, and be honest with yourself, okay? If that happened, learn to recognize what that feels like. Because LSAT writers are like 10 times better than I am at doing that. They're going to bait you with far more alluring traps. Okay, so you really have to start to develop a sensitivity for when you are supplying assumptions to arguments to make them run, right? And when you feel it, it's just like, wait, hold on a second. Am I actually making assumptions? If I am making assumptions, let me just call those assumptions out, right? For example, this could be a controlled burn of a dummy house as part of training for firefighters, right? Firefighters need to understand different building structures and how the fire spreads, right? When is it safe to go into a house versus when it's not safe, right? So if that's the case, if that's why the house is on fire, then no, we should not put the fire out. In fact, you should let it keep burning so the firefighters can complete their training. Do you see what I mean? So an argument, that's the narrow analysis of this particular argument. The more broad version is whenever you smell a descriptive premise and a prescriptive conclusion, you just need to immediately jump to this. Be like, okay, wait. There's an is to ought assumption being made here, right? Or, if you want to take the assumption, bring it out, make an additional premise, you just need to say, oh, if the house is on fire, then we ought to put the fire out. As soon as you supply that, then this argument runs. Okay, so like I said, this was a bit more advanced, and we're still in the main conclusion part of the curriculum, but this is foreshadowing future logical reasoning questions that we're going to encounter soon enough.